symposium by the Chaplain Corps, and I was blessed to find out about what we call KPI indicators, which are, key performance indicators, which are KPIs. And so, what these things are pretty much just kind of for, fix something here. There we go. So KPI indicators are something chaplains use to basically counsel sailors. They're pretty much designed for religious program specialists on the deck plates, make decisions at the highest levels. By us gathering this information, we're able to help better assess the needs of the Navy. So based off some of the research that I was able to be a part of, I was able to just really blessed to be part of that research symposium. There was a huge distinction when it came to the importance when they explained how to measure the effectiveness, of spiritual readiness without reducing uh, the ministry of numbers. And so I believe during that presentation, I believe it was Captain Brian D. Widget. I believe that was his name. He was one of the main supporters for using the KPIs for us to gather deck plate data. And so one of the questions I was posed is how do we know if our religious ministry teams, the activities that they are leading are to pretty much they desire to lead? What are the spiritual outcomes for that? And so, one of the things I noticed was whether worship services and how they're conducted. We also wanted to know in regards to what the research was pointing out to was asking, how important counseling was. And we're getting somewhere, just stick with me. Another huge component, whether is that they were asking whether those activities produce measurable readiness outcomes across the force. So let's bring this all together. In the military, chaplains we have other things we do besides, our sermons. So one of the big things about being a chaplain is you tend to do a lot of counseling. And so a lot of one-on-ones. And I know for our pastors, we call that pastor care. If you're in the church, when you go see your pastor, if your pastor has time, you guys can get one-on-one counseling. But for a chaplain, that's part of what you do. And I know for our ministry and our churches, our pastors make time, but there are some churches that the pastor may not always uh, make time for pastoral care, or they may have someone actually over that department. Now, I've seen it before. But with chaplains, that's part of what you do. You have to make time for your pastoral care, your we call it ministry of presence, and so that's one of the small distinctive differences. And so, what the KPI indicators do is gather data through those counseling on what the needs of the Navy are, and we kind of want to put that data together in order for us to help make better decisions or to um, allow us to find those needs or those gaps. And so at the strategic level, KPIs belong to the Navy Chaplain Corps enterprise. These are, the leader's responsibility for doctrine, policy, enterprise-wide decisions. And so we got to really think about those entities, which include the chief of chaplains. We're talking about OPNAV. We're talking about policy developers, training organization, resource managers. So uh, according to Captain, which is KPIs pretty much support several critical functions. They enable data, information, decision making. They guide program development. They influence resource allocation, which is big. They keep training priorities. They inform future policies. That's huge. These are all strategic responsibilities. At this level, leadership is asking questions like a huge question would be, are the four spiritual vectors producing measurable outcomes? So what we want to look at when we're doing those type of things is we have to basically the chaplain corps, at least at the strategic level, right? They have to request funding or we have to request resources, but we have to bring something to Congress or whatever that liaison or point of contact is when we're doing these things. We have to show what the chaplain corps is doing in order to show we're having impact on our Marine sailors and Coast Guards. Another question that may come to the table is, are the religious ministry teams improving readiness across the fleet? And these are huge questions to ask. Um, Through my experience, the chaplains, some people use their chaplains, but you may come across a lot of sailors who've never had to go through their chaplain. Maybe they would, with technology, you might watch ministry online. So, what are the chaplains doing to engage the Marine sailors and Coast Guards to gain their attention to make sure that we're having our impact as ministers on the fleet? And so, this is how we gather that data. There are other things where we want to know where should there be policy changes? Where should new training be developed? See, these are huge questions to ask. And so, just to give you an example, there was maybe a year ago the Military Chaplain Act of 2025, where chaplains throughout, with the research that we've gathered, there was this huge desire to improve Title 10, which is where chaplains kind of have their leverage and their authority, but the chaplains, through the data that we have, wanted a little bit more authority. If you know anything about the chaplain corps, we are in an advised position. And so what they were pushing for was a little bit more authority when it comes to that advisement as subject matter experts. So we can't be overlooked when we're representing as the basically liaisons for the First Amendment and religion in the military, right? That's our expertise. And so you can have, through the research, there are moments where commanders may not either make time, or you can a chaplain unit can technically be ignored. And so how do you make sure that those things don't happen? And how do you make sure that the chaplain always has a seat at the table, especially in trying times as today? And so this is one of those tools that we use to show how we're impacting and how we're making change. And so that's really important when you're talking to large enterprises. Are you talking to an entity like the Navy, which, from my understanding, is worth $800 billion? And so, how does the voice of ministry stay relevant? How do we make sure that we're making the impacts that we need? And how do we record that data? So it's not just faith-based, but how are we letting those other entities know from a professional level that they can see empirically that we're making a difference? So some of the strategic ideas for KPIs might include force-wide trends in spiritual distress, relationships between spiritual readiness and retention, resilience, or misconduct, and enterprise-wide outcomes of religious ministry teams and programs. Simply put, strategic KPIs help validate the effectiveness of the chaplain corps and its mission. So, what about on the operational level? Then, so here at the next level, we were looking at strategic. This is where strategy becomes execution. Operational leaders include our fleet chaplains, our regional chaplains, our installation chaplains, major command leadership, and here KPI becomes a planning tool. So operational leaders use teams to compare units, identify trends, allocate ministry resources, and adjust the religious ministry team efforts before readiness declines. So it's really important that we are not reactionary, but we're proactive, is pretty much what that's saying. Let's get the data there before it's too late. Typical conclusions or typical things that questions we like to include would be which spiritual readiness vectors are struggling within the command? Are ministry efforts aligned with the operational? Are they aligned with operational stressors? Are we doing what we need to do to make sure that we're impacting the lives of Marine sailors and Coast Guards? If you've done any research in the military, there has been a trend of suicidal ideation, high level of stress, depression, isolation. So all these things where the spiritual leaders, our experts, have a responsibility, but not just to the military, but to our call as ministers, as imams, as rabbis, as whatever priestly position we hold. It's our job to make sure that we're creating the impact to support in those positions. And then from an officer perspective, gathering that data to show what we're doing to help. The other question is, are there gaps in the chaplain coverage? That's really important to know as well. Uh, do deployment cycles require different ministry strategies? Operational KPIs uh, may compare spiritual readiness before and after deployments, measure trends by warfare communities, or evaluate chaplain support against operational tempo. So we're just checking out, getting a gauge of each command has its own battle rhythm. It has its own, flow and system. And so what each chaplain, once you understand what the commander needs, how are we going to implement that? What do we know about when you have deployments coming in? And so what do those Marine sailors or Coast Guards need coming in? Um, what warfare, communities are we, addressing or dealing with? And then how do we, basically evaluate that as chaplains to support against operational tempo? And so we're basically trying to make sure that everyone's being able to complete the mission with honor. But we're also making sure that people's spiritual balance is there. One of the things that we do why we gather this research is we can reduce stress. Ministers can reduce the stress. Chaplains can reduce the suicide ideations or the stress, or the simple stress of just deployment after deployment. Being able to come to your pastor or to your chaplain and being able to have that support to get that separate time, and then making sure that again that we're recording that information. In other words, KPIs help operational leaders synchronize ministry with the mission required, which is huge when it comes to us supporting commands and making sure that we are relevant in how we're impacting our commands. Now, we come here to the tactical level. This is where chaplains and religious program specialists actually perform ministry. Here's where most of the important distinctions that in Captain Widget's framework, he basically was pointing out how important the tactical unit was for us in regards to managing KPI. They basically generate the data that eventually becomes the KPI indicators or the key performance indicators that we use. The mission at the tactical level is ministry. And so conducting worship, providing confidential counseling, responding during crisis, visiting sailors, caring for families, supporting commanders, Marines as well, and Coast Guards. There are human-centered activities. They are mission-driven, not metrics-driven. So uh, what tactical unit contributions are we offering when it comes to, what is that information that we're looking for? We're talking about the number of individuals, our attendance numbers, the participation rate, follow-up referrals, observing morale, stress indicators, engagement patterns, and quality observation are the qualitative observations, but as well as quality of life. And how are we looking at that? How are we measuring that? That's really important. That information moves up through the organization where it is analyzed and transformed into the enterprise level. And that's the performance indicators. And so in a lot of ways, the chaplain corps, it is a function, it is a business. And so that's where they're looking at the support that we need based off the impact that we're having. The tactical level produces the data. Strategic and operational use the KPI. So tactical, that's when you're going to chapel. That's when you're going to counseling, as we stated before, and we're looking at how that is impacting the morale of each command, our ship, whatever it may be. Uh, that is important for doctrinal distinctions and just information in general. So the priority flow. The entire process follows a clear hierarchy. The strategic level defines spiritual readiness. It establishes the KPIs, develops policy, and allocates resources. Operational, this level interprets those KPIs, adjusts plans, synchronizes ministry efforts, and aligns religious ministry.
Good afternoon.
1 second.
Calling on teens and tweens. Every Wednesday, Brigadier General Charles.
Sorry about that. Just was an announcement here. So to continue, um, the operational level interprets KPIs, they adjust plans, they synchronize ministry efforts, and align religious ministry teams with command priorities. So just to simply, once we get all the resources allocated, we're going to develop a plan now. And how are we going to implement that plan into the tactical level? Based off what we're going to say now, the tactical level executes ministry, generates data, provides real world feedback from Marine sailors and Coast Guards. And so we're gathering the information, we're sending it up, and it's kind of recycling. So once it goes back up to the strategic level based off the KPIs, what the KPIs has offered, now we can get those resources and send it back to make sure we're taking care of our Marine sailors and Coast Guards. So each level has different responsibilities. None replaces the other. Together, they create this beautiful symbiotic relationship of our chaplain corps. KPIs are strategic and operational leadership tools. They validate the outcomes, not the individual activities. They inform leadership decisions, not ministry moments. The tactical level exists to care for people and generate meaningful observations. And so that's really important. Like I said, there's different sides, and within anything that requires tools, resources, and support. The operational level transform those observations into planning. The strategic level transforms that planning into policy, resources, and future directions for the Navy Chaplain Corps. Understanding the distinction preserves the integrity of ministry while ensuring that spiritual readiness can be measured, improved, and supported across the entire fleet, which is what we need. So I think it's really important to really get a gauge on these elements. And so another thing that we wanted to bring in is as a chaplain, we don't work by ourselves. So we work with religious program specialists. And so those are, remember, chaplains, I think I've mentioned this before, we're non-combatants. So as a non-combatant, it's pretty self-explanatory. You're not combatant. So we have these trained, members, usually chiefs are from the enlisted side. They're the combatants. They basically allow for the chaplain to do their job, to focus on ministry. There's a huge history behind that. Some of it points to priests who become combatants can technically lose their priest license or their ministry license if they were to become combatants. So one of the things that happened is they pretty much voted on making the entire chaplain corps non-combatants in that regard, to allow us to have that space to make sure that we're focusing on the spiritual battle that we have to take care of. And so they provided the military created what we call our religious program specialist. Now it's different for different branches of service, but I'm not sure what the Army calls them. But even before then, they used to have YNs, and then it became religious program specialists. And so you work hand in hand with them. And so they're also involved with collecting the data for KPIs. So their role is they do manage KPIs. They analyze the spiritual readiness data. And so you guys are working together, right? And so, according to what we know about the religious program specialist and what you know, it is shown through what's provided is that RPs play an essential role in supporting the KPIs, but their role is, indirect, enabling, and bound by doctrine. So they're not the chaplain. So they're going to have they're going to have limitations. They do not design KPIs. They do not interpret the data. They don't make readiness decisions. That's the chaplain. So that's why we're in constant communication and you're working directly with your religious program specialist and just any officer. You want to make sure that you have a connection to some chief. They usually are the liaisons between you and the enlisted community. Now the chaplain is a little bit different because even with that, we're one of the few when it comes to being a staff officer, we're supposed to be all throughout the command because we need to get a tempo because we're dealing with people's spiritual livelihoods. So although we work with the religious program specialists, we're not line officers. And so it's going to be a different request many times from what we're looking for from our RPs, our chiefs, in regards to support for our enlisted members. And so understanding that doctrinal role, the RP, um, basically they work with us at the operational and the administrative level when it comes to the professional aspect. They enable the chaplain, as I stated before, to kind of do our jobs as ministers. Uh, their mission is to support the religious ministries, pretty much to protect our, our right for the freedom and the exercise of religion, and to provide administrative and logistical and operational assistance. So I think the other big thing that I want to point out is that the responsibilities that they have for helping us determine the spiritual outcomes and helping us establish policies, those responsibilities, technically belong to the chaplain and senior leadership, but there is a distinction that keeps each member in the religious team operating within their doctrinal positions. And so the primary contribution of the RPs occurs on a tactical level. And again, because we're dealing right there on a deck plate, that's where the ministry is happening. And so this is where ministry, happens every day. Religious program specialist supports their chaplain. They perform tasks um, that become the foundation for, future KPI reporting. They track attendance at the worship services, and which supports the notion that we need to gather and collect this data. They maintain administrative records. They assist the after action and reports. They help, documentation and participate in ministry events. They are observing trends. They are also paying attention to morale, and they're also there for the operational stress and communicate uh, these, operational tensions to the chaplain. Right. That's usually who is, the direct point of contact to your Marine sailors and Coast Guards. Is your religious program, well, more so your sailors is your um, and Coast Guards is your religious program specialist. So there's a lot that they have to comply with as far as information that is required from them. Every one of these activities that they help contribute as far as the data. However, the RPs are not necessarily measuring spiritual readiness. The RPs are documenting what occurred. So they document it, but then we, as chaplains, we're the ones measuring it. So they're collecting the data. They're in there. They're letting us know what's going on. The information from there, we take the raw materials from which the KPIs have developed, and then we take it as chaplains and start to do our research and put that in a way that can be quantified. And Without our RPs, us getting a accurate without our RPs, us getting an accurate assessment of our, data can be really difficult. They really are our point of contact there. So remember, for some chaplains, if you're not a prior, you come in straight out of college, right? You come straight from seminary. And if you don't have any military experience, you are not going to be able to, in my opinion, you may. So the network kind of just crashed. We're almost done here. Give me 1 second. As some of you know, sometimes when you're doing the work of the Lord, the enemy doesn't like that. So sometimes you run into little situations here. And so we're almost done here. So let's get through this. And so as we talk about the support of our religious program specialists, their contribution is um, data integrity. And so reliable information begins with disciplined documentation. And so gathering that information for us is really important. And so that's really, really important for us. So operational level and supporting the chaplain as information moves forward and upward, the organizations, the RPs continue to provide that support. Operational level rely on accurate reporting, understanding the trends across the commands and deployment cycles. So here, RPs assist the chaplains by preparing reports, ensuring required information is submitted on time, organizing historical records, and supporting the inductions and readiness assessments. The important distinction is that the chaplain interprets the information. The RP enables that interpretation. You can think of it in this way. The chaplain serves as an operational interpreter. The religious program specialist serves as the operational enabler. Both are essential. They are responsible. Their responsibilities are different. When it comes to the strategic level, that point, the responsibility shifts as leadership. The chief of chaplains, policy developers, and senior Navy leaders establish spiritual readiness frameworks, evaluate KPI, allocate resources, and shape future policy. Religious program specialists do not perform these functions. They do not define KPIs. They do not validate the spiritual readiness vectors. They do not establish policy. They do not determine enterprise readiness. Yet their work still matters when it comes to us working together in the chaplain corps. Without the accurate reporting from the religious program specialist, senior leadership would have an incomplete picture of spiritual readiness across the force. Boundaries that protect the ministry. Doctrine also established clear limits on religious program specialists and their responsibilities. Uh, They do not judge spiritual outcomes. They do not replace pastoral assessments and statistics. They do not determine whether someone is spiritually healthy. They do not make readiness determinations on behalf of the commander. These boundaries protect several important principles. They preserve the chaplain's professional authority. They protect the First Amendment religious right for freedom. And they are to safeguard the ethical and the pastoral integrity of ministry. Numbers can inform leadership. They can never replace the human relationship between the chaplain and the people they serve. So the entire process follows a clear chain of responsibilities. At the strategic level, senior leadership is defined by spiritual readiness, which our senior leaders define spiritual readiness and they establish KPIs and they shape policy. At the operational level, the chaplain interprets the KPIs and spiritual readiness and advise commanders. At the tactical level, religious program specialists execute ministry support, collect reliable information, and provide that data that makes meaningful assessments possible. Each level supports the next. Each has a unique responsibility. Together, they create a complete framework. Now, based on what the religious program specialists, uh, what their roles are, and what the it's clear. Religious program specialists are indispensable to the credibility of key performance indicators. They provide accurate, consistent, and disciplined tactical level information. They do not own KPIs. They do interpret spiritual. They do not interpret spiritual outcomes. They enable chaplains and senior leaders to make informed and defensible and data-supported decisions. In the end, the strength of the KPI begins with faithful execution at the tactical level, and that is where the religious program specialist plays a indispensable role within the religious ministry team. And so, again, I want to thank you guys for tuning in today. Uh, if you enjoyed this discussion and you guys like the content that I'm providing, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Uh, I really would appreciate you guys' support in that regards, just making sure that we're getting the information out there. I would like to see ministers maybe take their, chance at serving as a chaplain in the military. This is my part to try to encourage that. And so hopefully you guys are learning something just like I have, and maybe you'll take that opportunity to one day not only be a minister of the gospel, but also take the opportunity to give back to your nation. And so thank you guys, and God bless.